Karahan Tepe and the Cosmic Serpent with Andrew Collins. You are listening to Brothers of the Serpent podcast.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, angels and demons and monsters and serpents. This is Brothers of the Serpent podcast, and we are coming to you not live from the 10 by 10 by 10 Tangent Cube of Science, where we are nestled amongst the dusty bones of an ancient seabed high atop the Edwards Plateau. And this week we have a very special guest joining us from across the pond in the UK, Mr. Andrew Collins, author of many books. He's studied Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe a lot. We're going to talk about that today. And actually, he was recommended by Hugh Newman, which we were hanging out with last time we were in the UK. And he was like, you got to talk to Andrew. And we agreed. And so here we are. Andrew is on the show. Thanks for coming on, man. Thank you very much.
Well, good day to you, gentlemen. You're in Texas, I believe. And
That's right.
Just outside of London, where it's a pretty cold, miserable night. But that's why I'm wearing the hat, and I may even put some gloves on a little later. We'll see what happens.
Oh man, is it that cold in your place there?
Well, we just had Storm Dara hit at the UK yesterday, and I think it's basically over now. But it sort of stopped football matches, and bridges were closed, and sadly somebody was killed. And so it's really heavy wind stuff, and it was bitterly cold at the same time. So I was quite happy to try and go from my car to my house and get inside, basically. But it's like that there. I'm sure it's not like that where you are.
No, it's. I mean, we had some rain yesterday, but it's not that cold. Not at all.
It's like in the 40s Fahrenheit.
Yeah, 40s Fahrenheit. Yeah. So
it's 30s. Yeah.
Kyle and I have been really interested in Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, obviously, because this is like one of the. I mean, it's the oldest evidence for any kind of construction. Like, especially the megalithic construction, like a concerted construction effort that took lots of people, and took many, many years. And we visited it. We've made some videos about it, but I think you have some interesting takes on it. So do you want to basically let's start with how did you get interested in this kind of thing, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I mean, how did I get interested? Well, from a child, I was always interested in the strange, dark and mysterious, as it were. Whether it be ghosts, UFOs, astral projection, dreams. And I sort of followed that up with reading pulp paperbacks at a very early age. And that sort of eventually led me into what's known as the Earth Mysteries, which was basically the whole idea that the megalithic structures of the landscape were in patterns like ley lines, and the energy flowed between them, that the ancients had this understanding of geometry, metrology, built into the design, which was like some kind of lost megalithic science. Books by people like John Michel, inspired me. But I also, at the same time, was reading books by Eric von Daniken. Was God an Astronaut? Chariots of the Gods being the most obvious title. And I mean, the thing that type of book did was made you think. It made you think, well, what if there was some kind of higher intelligence involved with the rise of civilization, or the creation of monuments like the Great Pyramid or the Nazca Lines or anything like this? And, so that sort of spurred me on, really. But, I mean, I wrote various books which were all about something that I call psychic questing, which is basically working with psychics out in the landscape, discovering artifacts, fighting off black magicians, all sorts of weird stuff like that for years. But finally, I was sort of ready to start writing sensible books. And the first book that I wrote was From the Ashes of Angels, that came out in 1996. And basically what this did was to look at all of the stories to do with the foundation of civilization, which occurred, we now know, in southeastern Turkey, and to connect them with stories, myths and legends to do with wisdom bringers, mythical beings that came onto the scene and were said to have provided the rudiments of civilization to mortal kind. Now we're talking about the Watchers of the Book of Enoch, and their offspring, of course, the Nephilim. We're talking about the Anunnaki in Mesopotamian tradition, and other similar examples in the myths of other surrounding countries, like in Iran, for instance. There's the story of the Immortals. The Immortals were said to be like these sort of like godlike individuals who helped humanity, became the ancestors of the earliest kings or whatever. They too, passed on the rudiments of civilization. And it became clear that all of this had occurred in the same area, the area that is traditionally known as the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden, although it might be seen as a mythical location, it's not. I mean, it was a geographical location. It's mentioned in the Bible on a few occasions, and it can quite easily be pinned down to southeastern and also to eastern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And I'll tell you for why. Because it's said that the 4 rivers of paradise flow out of the Garden of Eden, or the terrestrial paradise. And they can easily be identified as 4 real rivers. That's the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Greater Zab, which eventually flows into the Tigris when it reaches Iraq, and also the Artsis River, which flows eastwards into the Caspian Sea. Those are the 4 traditional rivers of paradise, and they all rise in eastern Turkey, in an area called the Armenian Highlands, which is on the northern part of the country. So we've got a geographical area, and what I suggested was that these watchers, these Nephilim, the Immortals, the Anunnaki, are a memory of those that gave humanity the rudiments that allowed the technology and innovation to create what's known as the Neolithic Revolution. And I pinpointed this as occurring somewhere, as I said, in southeastern Turkey. And this book came out in 1996. It was a bestseller in the Times newspaper, and also on top of that, it started to cause a bit of a controversy, not just in this country but also in Turkey, which is mainly featured. But we'll come on to that. But what happened was that eventually it was published in a Turkish language edition in 2002. And this allowed me to go out in 2004 to see these sites that I've been writing about. Now, I knew nothing about Göbekli Tepe when I wrote From the Ashes of Angels. But as I was writing that book, I was aware... Sorry, hold on. Sorry, somebody's trying to ring me. I'm just sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
I apologise. Hopefully it won't happen again. Throw that away. Sorry. Right, now I wasn't aware of the existence of Göbekli Tepe when I wrote...
True Faith, what's up, man?
But
Hope that Iron Boy, yeah, man.
as I was writing that book,
I will.
We'll
We'll do a set for you right now.
During the day, the first spades were going into the
Bicep
ground
curls,
at
what's up, man?
Göbekli Tepe.
Merry Christmas, dude.
And
Thanks,
this would
buddy.
not be
Appreciate that.
revealed to the world
Let's
until
fucking
the
get
year
it. How are you, man? Hope you're good.
2000. And then there was a huge spread in a German magazine, which somebody drew my attention to. And I looked at that and I said, well, there you go. There's your smoking gun, if you like, of everything that I've written about, because it's very clear that there's a culture here, a society, a tiered society, a structure which would have involved hundreds of thousands of people, creating these incredible stone enclosures with their T-shaped pillars, each of which are carved either with animals or with anthropomorphic features, like human-like features. And it was right in the area. And what's so interesting is that the person that actually discovered Göbekli Tepe, Klaus Schmidt, who I met on a few occasions before he sadly passed away in 2014, is that he wrote a book in 2012 where he actually states, about Göbekli Tepe, where he actually states that he believed that the pillars were the ancestors of those that created Göbekli Tepe, and that they were the Anunnaki of Mesopotamian tradition. Now, he doesn't call them Anunnaki. What he calls them is the Anuna. The Anuna is the original Sumerian term for the Anunnaki, and it's a word meaning something like of the sky or possessed of the sky. And you could break that down quite simply into the sky people. And I mean, some people might want to see this as further evidence that the Anunnaki are space beings that came down here, but I don't think so. I think what you're looking at here are flesh.
It's nice to warm up like that.
That gave us the rudiments of civilization. I mean, for instance, it says that the Anunnaki.
Hope you're doing well, man.
Gave us sheep and grain. Sheep and grain is clearly a metaphor for animal husbandry.
I've put off lifting weights because of fucking damn agent. I'm like, no, I'm gonna put me first, not this fucking damn agent shit. Try to take care of me first. I can't neglect my fucking health.
It's said that we also worked with them to create the first irrigation ditches. So in other words, that's obviously part of the whole farming system. And you know, just things like this, made it clear that we're dealing with flesh and blood human beings. But then if you come on to the Watchers were said to be able to lay with mortal women, who then produced giant-sized offspring that were named Nephilim. And that they ran amok, and that the Watchers that were still loyal to heaven rounded up the Nephilim, killed them all, although they clearly weren't all killed because they appear later on in the Bible. And that the rebel Watchers were supposedly rounded up and put in prison. Now, I mean, obviously, we're seeing this through the lens of, Hebrew peoples, Semitic peoples, that probably originated in the area of southeastern Turkey. I mean, that certainly was the original language that was spoken in that area, which was Akkadian, which was the language that would eventually be adopted in Sumer and combined with Sumerian to form the Sumero-Akkadian language, which most of the texts that we know were all created originally in this language. So I think that what we're seeing in all of these myths and legends is a memory of the prime movers behind the construction of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, sites which I've been going to, since that time. I mean, in 2004, for instance, I got to see Göbekli Tepe for the first time, and whilst I was in the area, I was told about the existence of this new site called Karahan Tepe, and I was shown a picture of a stone, a T-pillar, and it had this snake crawling up the side of it. And I realised that this was clearly part of the same culture as Göbekli Tepe. So I thought, I've got to find it. Now, all I knew is that it was in a remote region about 25 miles away from Göbekli Tepe called the Tek Tek Mountains. So I was there a couple of days later with a driver and interpreter, and nobody anywhere seemed to know where this site was, until finally we spoke to this guy in complete Arab dress. Bear in mind, he's very near the Syrian border, and driving a tractor, and he just sort of pointed, and we went in the direction he pointed. We eventually came across this farmhouse, and a little boy came out, spoke to our interpreter, and just pointed south, and there was a hill, limestone, north-south orientated hill. We walked towards that, and I started to see flint tools, stone tools, on the ground. And the closer we got to this hill, the more there were, until eventually there were hundreds of them all over the place. It's clear that there'd been an incredible amount of activity, and I recognised the style as meaning that whatever was going on here had to be at least 10 to 11,000 years old. And also what you had was these right-angled pieces of what are known as porthole stones, just carved, beautifully carved, looking like something from a medieval window.
Oh yeah.
Just lying about here and there from now lost enclosures. And also on top of that, you had just sticking out of the hard soil and rubble at the base of the hill, and on the side of the hill itself, and even going up to the top of the hill, what were quite clearly T-pillars. And these T-pillars were like those at Göbekli Tepe, not so big, I must point out, But it was clearly, once again, part of the same culture. So it was clear that somewhere underneath this sort of rubble was a complex that was similar to Göbekli Tepe. And I continued to go there, you know, year after year after that, eventually obviously with Hugh Newman and his partner JJ Ainsworth, and we covered every single part of this. We went into every hole, climbed every hill, you know, looked as far as we possibly could for evidence of human activity. And then in 2018 we learned that the place was about to be surveyed in preparation for full excavations that would begin the following year in 2019. And that was it. But of course, I mean, I didn't get out there the following year, and then obviously all the lockdowns happened. But in 2021 it was announced what they'd actually discovered, and when I saw the pictures I thought, oh my god, I mean, it was like a lost city that they've now uncovered. In fact, I call it the lost city of the Anunnaki, because I think that's exactly what it is. This is what you've got there. It's 11,500 years old. It was built right at the end of the last ice age. It's contemporary with Göbekli Tepe, clearly part of the same culture, but something different was going on at Karahan Tepe, something much deeper, much rawer, and I would even say much darker, because you've got structures that are actually cut out of the bedrock itself, that are dropped down. I mean, one, for instance, which we call the Pillar Shrine, which is actually structure AD, has these 10 pillars coming vertically out of the ground that cut out the bedrock themselves, and out of the wall facing into the hill you have this oversized human head, which is probably about 3 times the size of a normal human head, and it's on the end of a long serpentine net. I mean, the whole thing looks like something out of Beetlejuice, to be honest. I mean, yeah. It is a very, very peculiar carving to do. And the fact that the head is so large is just extraordinary. And you have to start asking yourself, what was going on here? Well, I mean, obviously, you know, you're the brothers of the serpent, and the serpent seems to be the most important symbol at this site. I mean, not only was it there on that original picture of the stone that I saw, which by the way has now disappeared. I don't know whether it eventually went into a museum or was stolen or whatever, I don't know. But certainly it appears on various other stones now. It's on the side of benches, it's carved into the bedrock, and even at least 2 of the actual enclosures that have been carved out of the bedrock, I think actually are the heads of snakes. In other words, they're the hollow 3D representation of snakes' heads. I mean, I've overlaid them with a local snake called the Anatolian meadow viper, very poisonous snake, indigenous to the Tekpek Mountains, and it fits perfectly. And it's even possible that these vertical pillars coming out of the ground are meant, certainly in abstract form, to represent the fangs of the actual snake itself. I mean, these pillars do look a bit phallic, yes, you have to admit that, but I don't necessarily think that was their primary symbolic function. I think that it was a much higher concept than that. We also know that these structures are aligned towards the solstices. I mean,
yeah, man, I haven't had any whey protein
of this
in 8 months. That's crazy. 8 months. No way. I'm a lot more. Not a lot more lean, but I'm a little more lean.
Twice on 2 different days. I was able to sit.
I did put on a little weight since I came back from China.
And record it.
Thank you, man.
And this is an incredible thing because
my interview, yes, the 30th.
And we know that in 9000
so,
BC,
still getting ready for that.
Was constructed,
I'm hopeful for that, though, bro.
Just slightly down a bit, you know, to do with the movements of the Earth and its relationship to the axis, and therefore this alignment would be even better. It would have fully illuminated the head itself. Plus, I separately found that another one of the enclosures there, structure AA, which we call the pit shrine, because it's got this huge, weird pit right in the centre of it, cut out the bedrock. that's aligned to the summer solstice, not the winter solstice, but the summer solstice at sunset. In other words, as the sun hit the horizon, this particular enclosure would be directly facing towards it, and you'd have been able to stand in it and look directly at that. But this is where it starts getting interesting, because if you continue to remain in that enclosure for another 2 hours, when it gets dark, you'd have seen an incredible sight, because at the exact spot that the sun itself had just disappeared below the horizon, you would see the Milky Way stretching vertically upwards, right in the middle of which was this dark area known as the Dark Rift. And right at the base, as it's just gradually setting at that moment, you have what's known as the galactic bulge. The galactic bulge is the centre of our own Milky Way galaxy, and of course, if you think of the Milky Way, it encircles our world, and was obviously known and revered in the past. It was much brighter, and the brightest part of it was the galactic bulge. And this is significant because this was seen in the past as the head of a creature whose body would be the actual Milky Way itself. And very often this was seen as a snake or a serpent. And this is reinforced in the area of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, in the fact that sorry, lost my train of thought. A second. Whoops, that's weird. Right, so yes, okay, so basically this is the cosmic serpent. The cosmic serpent is the Milky Way. The head of the serpent is the galactic bulge itself, which in the past would have been much brighter than it is today.
You think this could be the oldest Ouroboros, right? If it's the head.
It is the Ouroboros.
Yeah, it goes all the way around and it's eating itself, so it's, cosmic serpent.
It's what we call the world encircling snake, or world encircling, and it was seen to exist beyond the physical landmass, which presumably in the past they were only aware in theory of one landmass. But obviously they weren't stupid. They knew that waters were beyond that landmass. So they thought that this snake existed in what's known as the cosmic ocean. In other words, where our ocean basically became a part of the sky itself, the snake existed in that. I mean, one of the most obvious examples of this is the Midgard serpent in Norse tradition.
Yes.
This is shown coiling around the huge tree called the Yggdrasil, which is an ash tree, which has its top branches in the sky world, its base of the trunk in the middle world, and the roots are in the lower world or the underworld, and around the middle you see the great snake curling, the Midgard serpent. This is a typical example of this, but these ideas are found all over the world. I mean, they're found in Mesopotamia, they're in Turkey, they're in India, they're in North America, Central America, South America. I mean, this is a universal concept, and I am pretty certain that what was going on at Karahan Tepe was communication via shamans with this Milky Way serpent, and particularly the head, because the head was seen as the soul, the spirit of it. And what's so interesting is that the stars of the constellation of Scorpius, almost seem to come out the mouth of this head of this serpent, almost as if they represent the forked tongue, or the active spirit, or the words coming out of it. And therefore, I think that this is one of the reasons why Scorpius itself not only became a scorpion. I mean, various cultures obviously recognised it as a scorpion, but many cultures also recognised it as a snake. I mean, even the serpent mound in Adams County, Ohio, has been interpreted as an earthen representation of the constellation of Scorpius in its form as a serpent or a snake. So these are universal ideas, and I think this is what was going on at Karahan Tepe. The bigger question is what were they really up to? I mean, okay, they may have believed this, but is that what was really happening? You know, did they truly believe that there was some kind of higher intelligence that they could communicate with via the galactic bulge? And what's so interesting there is that, yes, it is the centre of our own Milky Way galaxy, and the ancients were definitely aware that this area of the sky was very, very important in the past. But on top of that, free thinkers like Rupert Sheldrake has written a paper actually suggesting that the supermassive black hole at the centre of our Milky Way galaxy could be not just sentient, but a cosmic being in its own right, one that would be almost recognised as a sort of localised form of God. You know, a God that protects its own, if you like. In other words, all of the matter that has been created within the galaxy itself. So, I mean, these are incredible concepts, and I think that at Tarahan we've got some, whether it be purely intuitive or knowing understanding of the sky and this want to connect with this cosmic source, this creator of the universe itself.
I know, yeah, he has. I remember hearing Sheldrake talk about the possibility of the sun being a conscious being. I hadn't known that he suggested maybe the black hole. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I like that.
Well,
That's amazing.
The paper that he wrote about the sun being a conscious being, that's got all the stuff in it about the supermassive black hole being a conscious being.
Wow. Yeah, yeah, it could be, absolutely. I mean, consciousness, if consciousness is a fundamental part of the universe, then something like a supermassive black hole would have a whole lot of it in there, right? It's basically concentrated, so that's really interesting. I do have some questions, though, about the concept of this area being the Garden of Eden. I find this fascinating, so I have some questions about that. But first, I want to ask so we are also really interested in the civilizer gods, these, you know, the Anunnaki, the Viracochas of South America.
Yeah.
What do you think of this idea that they're part of a lost, like a collapsed civilization? Like, do you think that's what happened? That they have come to this area to sort of try to rebuild something, or do you think that they're actually becoming civilizer gods at the time, or are they trying to teach people? Like,
well, I mean, this all comes down to speculation.
Sure.
Than
Yeah.
anything else, because, you know, we haven't got the anatomical evidence to back up any of this ultimately. So it just becomes a hypothesis, and the hypothesis of Graham Hancock, for instance, is that there was a lost civilization. It reached a high point at the time of the last ice age, and was destroyed in a cataclysm, one which we identified today with the so-called Younger Dryas event, which was a 1200-year mini ice age that went from 10,800 down to 9,600, which is the exact date when Göbekli Tepe was founded. So, you know, in other words, it was wiped out in this window of 1,200 years. Now, obviously, we are still looking for the smoking gun, if you like, of that lost civilization. But with me, I see things slightly differently. I mean, I don't evoke ideas like Atlantis to answer everything, which I think some of my colleagues firmly do. I don't think you actually need, you know, the idea that there was some kind of, you know, super civilization that got wiped out in the last ice age, because the evidence can come from our distant cousins, you know, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and possibly even other types of early humans that coexisted with anatomical modern humans like ourselves for quite a long period of time. I mean, perhaps as much as 150,000 years, until eventually our contact with them, particularly in areas like Siberia, Mongolia, led to their demise. Whether this was, you know, through our actions or climate or whatever, we don't know. But the legacy of these people was lived on within us. Basically, we carried not only their genes, but also the legacy of all of their achievements. And I mean, for instance, the Denisovans, who we now know probably inhabited, for the most part, the areas of the Tibetan Plateau, Siberia, Mongolia, China, possibly even as far out as Taiwan, that they achieved incredible stuff by the time of their disappearance 30 to 40,000 years ago. I mean, just look up the Denisovan bracelet, as it's called. It's this beautiful green bangle, which has a hole that's drilled through it that has been examined by scientists, and that the feed rate for this drill hole is so fast that it's comparable to a modern day drill. Now, I mean, that alone should raise the eyebrow and say, who the hell were these people? But on top of that, they create the first bone needles for tailored clothing. There's evidence that they may have domesticated and ridden horses. There's evidence also that they created the earliest musical instruments. And I think that there's a possibility from the legends that exist in the very areas that they were, which talk about these, giant individuals. And what we know about the Denisovans so far is that they were huge, that they were comparable in size to the largest WWE wrestlers or the largest American footballers, is that they are possibly the memory of the giants, or they're behind these legends of the giants. And of course that brings awesome. In the stories of the Watchers and the Nephilim. I mean, you have to look at the Watchers and Nephilim through the lens of Hebrew myth and legend. There was not a universal idea about Watchers and Nephilim. This has purely come to us through Hebrew sources, whether it be the Book of Enoch, the Book of Giants, the Book of Jubilees, and other similar texts that talk about the antics, the lifestyle, the society of these Watchers and their offspring, the Nephilim. But what is this a memory of? And I think it's a memory of those that carried the legacy of the Denisovans from Siberia, Mongolia, all the way down into southwestern Asia, what is today Anatolia, and the evidence that these large figures, these really oversized humans were about, is now coming to light at Karahan-Tepe, for instance. I mean, just last year, they discovered this new enclosure, a huge new enclosure, on the very top of the hill. And in it, they found this giant human statue that's actually in a seated position. So it sort of goes down like that. Now, even with it being seated, it's 7.5 feet tall. It's got a huge head, similar sort of size-wise to the head that's in the pillar shrine. But this is much more anatomically correct. Even in the ears, there's little holes where they would have hung earrings, for instance, something I only noticed earlier on this year. And who is this person? What does it represent? Now, it's easy to say, it's a divine ancestor, part of some kind of clan or tribal line. But why make them so big? Why? I mean, if this guy stood up, if he was able to, he'd probably be as much as 9 feet tall. Why create statues so tall? And I think that it's a memory of very tall people that were behind the foundation of these structures. And I think, therefore, we are looking towards the founders, the builders, the prime movers of the Tash Tepelah culture, because that's what the scientists, archaeologists want to call this civilization.
Yeah, the Tash Tepelah,
which means stone hills or stony hills.
I like this idea. I like this idea because now you're making me think of the Göbekli Tepe enclosures. You can look at it as these two really tall central figures with tool belts and things, and they're standing there and they're sort of surrounded by smaller figures facing inwards, like they're being taught, like it's a school.
Yeah,
that's exactly correct.
Yeah, cool.
There you go. And I mean, the pillars that you're talking about that are in the centre of, let's say, enclosure D, I mean, they're 18 feet tall.
Yeah.
5.5 metres tall. I mean, that's enormous. And yet, when you look at them, one of them, the head is horizontal, perfectly horizontal. But the other one, the head
tilted down.
is tilted down towards you, as if it is looking down at you.
Right.
Yeah, as if it's looking at you from this great height. And that's something that you find in churches with certain statues of Christ or the Virgin Mary or whatever. If they're meant to be placed high, then their heads will be tilted so that they're looking down at you. And this is a very, very similar principle. You know, the idea that when you go into these enclosures and approach between these pillars, you're doing so because you are honouring the presence of these great ones. Now, whether they are ancestors or celestial beings or whatever, it depends on interpretation, really. But that's what's going on here, I'm sure of it.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking about with Eden, you know, in the Bible, after they're banished from Eden, it says that, you know, an angel's placed at the entrance with a flaming sword to guard the entrance. And I'm thinking, of course, of the Younger Dryas and this impact. And the idea of a flaming sword is basically what stands between
one age and the next.
Yes, one age and the next. Humans are blocked through time from going back into Eden because it was destroyed with a flaming sword. This you know, these impacts coming from the sky.
Yeah, no,
But,
I think that's probably correct. Actually,
yeah, it's interesting how.
I mean, if you look in, let's say, Chinese tradition, there's a whole illustration that's done of different comets in the sky. I mean, you'll find it online, and at least one of them is as a sword, basically. So the idea of the sword being a comet, and I think maybe, you know, we need to talk about comets for a moment, because the smart money is on the beginning of the Younger Dryas being triggered by a comet impact, or more specifically, the fragmentation of a fragment of comet that probably passed around the sun on its so-called perihelion, its closest approach. And as it came out of that orbit, it was basically, you know, sent towards the Earth, and it then begins to break up, until you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of small parts of this comet fragment that very quickly enter the atmosphere and explode, what's known as air blasts. And these totally devastate the northern hemisphere, from probably Siberia through to Alaska, across obviously the ice caps that were in America, creating other craters, so-called Carolina Bays, from New York State all the way down to Florida. These are these oval aligned craters that were only noticed from the air once we started flying over them, I think in the 1920s. But also it was in Europe, and it reached as far as the area of Göbekli Tepe. I mean, there's evidence of activity dating from about 10,800 BC on a site called Abu Huraira, which is on the Euphrates, which is about 150 miles away from Göbekli Tepe, which clearly suggests a comet impact. Or sorry, not so much a comet impact, but an air blast that's created so much heat that it's melted the sand and the small stones and soil, whatever it is, direct beneath it. And that's there. That's on the Euphrates. You know, I mean, unfortunately, we can't go to it today because one of the dams on the Euphrates has caused that particular site to be drowned, unfortunately. But we certainly have many samples from it that show that, you know, that there was some kind of air blast that took place there. And of course, this is a common thing all around the world. And what I suggested in my book, Göbekli Tepe: Genesis of the Gods, that came out in 2014, was that there was comet imagery on the stones at Göbekli Tepe, in particular Pillar 18, which is the big one that we've already talked about on the right-hand side as you go into Enclosure D. And there you've got a belt buckle The guy's wearing a belt with various glyphs on it. He's got a belt buckle, and he's got like this 3-pronged disc. And immediately I saw that, I thought, that's a comet. That's a 3-pronged or 3-tailed comet. And in a particular position as well, obviously very close to the horizon with the sun beneath it. Either the sun's just set or the sun's about to rise, and it's there with the 3 prongs sticking up. And then directly beneath that belt, the figure's wearing a fox pelt loincloth. So it's the one next to it. But what's so important about that is that the fox is a symbol of a trickster, like the coyote in Native American tradition. It's a trickster. It can do good or it can do bad. You don't know. You don't know what it's going to do. But the fox, and particularly its tail, is a universal symbol of catastrophes, basically, and comets in particular. And I mean, I mean, even in heraldry, for instance, in European heraldry, a comet is shown as a fox's tail, for instance. I mean, clearly from some weird ancient tradition which has now been lost. So I think what's going on here is that these enclosures were originally built to pacify the people who were still in a state of fear every time a comet came into the sky. They'd fear that something bad was about to happen again. And I think that these prime movers, these elites, who I see in terms of shamans, possibly bird shamans, folk shamans, obviously snake shamans as well, come into the midst of these people who are probably the indigenous peoples of the region, and they say to them, look, don't worry, in the future there's going to be no further catastrophes, right? We'll make sure of that. We can see the signs in the sky, but for this to take place, you have to help us build these enclosures. They have to be made in a certain way. They have to be orientated in a certain way. They have to have these T-shaped pillars. You can all get together and start making them, and we're going to build them here. We're going to build them there. We're going to build them there. And so far we know of at least a dozen of these T-pillar sites that were built between 9,600 and about 8,000 BC. And they kept to the same style all the way through that entire period. I mean, that's the length that we've been building churches in the style that we build them today, with altars, in the east, in the direction of heaven, and obviously the iconography and the way that they're laid out and the rest of it. Why do we keep doing that? Why do we feel this need to create a church to look like a church? And of course the answer is fear that if we don't do it, something bad will happen. And I think that this is the same as places like Karahantepe and Göbekli Tepe, where you haven't just got the main enclosures, you have dozens of other smaller enclosures, some of them no bigger than the size of a jacuzzi, basically, because I say that because they've all got benches inside them that look like, Flintstones jacuzzis or something, with like tiny little T-pillars at the end of them, just a sort of like representation of the same idea. Is that why do you have to keep doing this? And also, why wasn't it found in a much wider area? We only find these in southeastern Turkey so far. Yes, there were contemporary cultures in northern Syria, in Iraq, probably in Iran, and certainly in central Turkey that have some of the components, but not the T-pillars. That's only in the area of the Şanlıurfa region. Şanlıurfa is the city there, and that was anciently known as Edessa. It was also the place of Abraham, where he begins his journey to the promised land. He's totally connected with that city. Even to this day, there's shrines to him there. The place where he was supposed to be born, the place where he was supposed to have been nearly killed by the wicked king Nimrod is there. But more importantly, and we've already started to talk about Eden here, is that the residents of Şanlıurfa have, for hundreds, and I'm going to assume thousands of years, believed that this was the location of the Garden of Eden. And even the most ancient name of Şanlıurfa talks about this, which is Adama, which means the place of Adam.
Yeah.
Adam as a word itself just means red earth, ultimately. And the story goes that God created the soul of Adam in heaven, and he brings them, puts him down on the ground at Shamlerfa, makes his body with the red earth, the beautiful red earth in that area, and then obviously, you know, from a rib or something, they create Eve. Of course, they live happily in the terrestrial garden until along comes the serpent. And the serpent says, yeah, why don't you eat of that tree over there, the tree of knowledge of good and evil? And so they say, all right, well, we'll do. They pluck this fruit, which, by the way, the whole idea of it being this nice rosy red apple or a pomegranate or something is a fiction. The word that's used in Hebrew for the word fruit also means seed and can mean the seed of wheat. And in various traditions, particularly in Islamic mysticism, the fruit of the Garden of Eden is actually a stalk of wheat. Okay? And this plays into the story from Shamlerfa, and I'll tell you for why. Because the story is that once they realised that they were naked and lost their innocence, God throws out Adam and Eve from the gardens lest they eat of the other tree in the garden, which is the tree of life, and learn how to live forever. So they're thrown out. As you said, you know, the entrance back into it is stopped by this angel with a whirling sword, which I think is a confusion of the catastrophe which probably took place earlier than Göbekli Tepe, but we'll come on to that. And they go onto the Haran plain according to the legend, and they have to till the land. And so basically, according to the story, Adam turns around to Eve and says, what are we going to grow? And she said, oh, what about this that I've got in my hand that I just happened to have brought out of heaven? And it's a stalk of wheat. So they grow wheat. But it's said that for the first several years, the yield is very small. And they're about to give up when a bull comes into their midst, and they think, oh, we can use this bull to plough the land. And the yield increases, and they all live happily after. And it's said that every year, to give thanks to the bull, they kiss the head of the bull. This is the story that's still told to this day in Shamlerfa. Now, what does that mean? Well,
I got some parallel bars. Let me show you.
Even to this day, amongst the indigenous peoples of the region, the bull is the earth itself. The horns of the bull holds up the heaven, and when that bull moves and shakes, you get earthquakes, you get volcanoes, you get thunderstorms. That's what people believe to this day. I mean, the guide on our tours, that, you know, there's a Kurdish man. I mean, he told us this story. I mean, just as a matter of fact, this is what people believe. And, you know, I thought, oh my God, what an incredible concept. But, you know, obviously I followed it through. I found out this wasn't simply something that was believed by him and his local community. This was much more widespread. And that this is clearly a very ancient idea. So the idea of Adam and Eve kissing the head of the bull is essentially them paying their respects to the earth itself, you know, for yielding them this. But, I mean, that's just a story. However, what's so important is that we know that agriculture begins for the first time in the very area of the Haran Plain. I mean, you know, something like 50 to 60 different varieties of wheat that we use today for everything from beer to bread to pasta to cakes, etc. Its DNA can be traced back to a wild form of wheat that grows to this day within sight of Göbekli Tepe. I mean, that's an extraordinary discovery, I think.
And do you think
it just shows you that these legends, which clearly are wrapped around the biblical Genesis story, obviously. Now, which came first, chicken or an egg, we don't know. But it clearly shows that legends can retain within them information, kernels of information, probably across, in this case, 10 to 10,500 years ago, when agriculture first starts appearing in this area. But then you have to start saying to yourself, well, okay, well, that's great. What about the serpent then? What's the serpent? And I think that this serpent, the serpent of Eden, is a abstract memory of the communications that were taking place at sites like Karahantepe, communicating with this cosmic serpent, and gaining information. They would go into an altered state of consciousness, probably using hallucinogens. They would allow the snake to possess them. And there are societies to this day that have rituals where God in the form of a snake will possess people, and they will hit the ground and writhe around like snakes, believing that the god has actually possessed them. I mean, it's there, for instance, in Thailand. I describe this in the book. It's there, obviously, within voodoo practices of Haiti, and it's almost certainly there, in other very fundamental Christian traditions. Snake veneration and speaking in tongues and whatever. So this is something which I think was going on in the past. And if you want a comparison, just look towards, let's say, the Oracle of Delphi, the mythical Oracle of Delphi. Now, according to the stories, a priestess known as a Pythia or an oracle would sit on a tripod-shaped chair seat, and this would be directly over fumes that would raise up and intoxicate her, and these would come from the rotting corpse of a serpent that had been killed by Apollo. And when this Pythia is in an intoxicated state, it said that Apollo himself would enter inside her, possess her, and speak through her mouth. But what's so interesting is that this is not Apollo as like some god of light, but a serpent, a snake. And you can clearly see this not just in the ancient images of the Pythia, the oracle, but also you. Sorry, I'm trying to ring me again. That's the other phone now. Right. But it was a mate of mine. I told him that I was doing that. But he clearly forgot, basically. He said, well, where is he? Why isn't he ringing me? Right, sorry. So, yes, possession. Yeah, I think that basically what was happening with the Oracle of Delphi is that this was a much more civilized form of what was happening at Karahantepe many thousands of years earlier. And it was oracular. It was about oracular communication, gaining knowledge from a cosmic supernatural source seen in terms of a snake, and that this information then would be conveyed to waiting attendants who would then share it with the rest of that society. That, I think, is the real story behind what was going on in the Garden of Eden, which we can associate with this very area.
So how do you take the standard model analysis of these mounds? I mean, to me, the Göbekli Tepe, Karahantepe are just massive midden mounds. Like you said, when you're walking up, you're seeing all the debitage, all the flakes and flint tools and all this stuff. These people, the pre-pottery Neolithic, were well established for decades before discovering these sites. And I mean, Jericho, many other sites all over where there's plenty of this same exact material. They were doing all the same stuff. They even possibly, had invented or started farming like roughly 1,000 years before Göbekli Tepe. And so, well, that's what some of the archaeologists say. Not at Göbekli Tepe,
but that's wild wheat, though. That's different to domesticated wheat. I mean, and we've been experimenting with wild wheat going back to 30,000 years ago. I mean, it's there, for instance, in Russia, amongst the Gravatian peoples there. The evidence has been found there. It was also extensively used in Egypt around 13,000 BC, at some sites in the area of Aswan that were clearly very, advanced peoples, and it was being used in the Levant, the countries that we now associate with Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. It was going back at 11,000 BC, before the time of the Younger Dryas. But the actual domestication and the widespread use of it does not occur until we hit around 8,500. And that almost certainly is what's going on in the area of Göbekli Tepe. And the Haran Plain is the central area of all the Taş Tepe sites. They are all situated around it, whether to the west, the east, the north.
That's fair enough.
Not the south. The south is we get into northern Syria, and although you've got what we call pre-pottery Neolithic sites there, they change in style. They're not the same. So it's mostly around the Haran Plain, and obviously with the city of Şanlıurfa being the main sort of central focus of it, certainly today. That I think that that was the core of it, really. I mean, even Şanlıurfa, we know that there was a massive Taş Tepe presence there because they've excavated the sites of them, and Urfa Man, this huge, was it 6.5 feet tall, pole-like human individual with these dark obsidian eyes, no mouth, no nose. That was found just to the north of what's known as the Pools of Abraham at Şanlıurfa, and that was clearly part of one of these Taş Tepe sites.
That's really what I'm wanting to get at. What I'm wanting to ask you about is not so much the farming aspect, but that the standard model wants to associate this midden mound of really roughly hewn flint tools with these beautifully carved megalithic constructions and statues and things like ornaments and things like that. Now, I just personally have looked at a lot of different lithic types, and the lithics at these sites are some of the most rudimentary lithics I've ever seen. We've got 12,000 years of lithics in the United States that they're just beautiful compared to these things that we find at Göbekli Tepe. Now, I love those too, but they're not sophisticated, and so I kind of think that like all this midden around these stone circles was like the pre-pottery Neolithic people finding these stone circles and venerating them and staying there, and the midden building up around them. This is how they get buried, in the midden. What do you think about that?
Well, look, there's plenty of dating evidence from these. We got obviously radiocarbon dates coming out from different positions at all of these sites.
Yeah.
But you've also got contextual dating. And that obviously is something that's built up over many decades and really goes back to the work of the British Egyptologist Flinders Petrie at the end of the 19th century of stratification and contextual evidence. And the stone tools that are found in the vicinity of both Göbekli and Karahan very clearly talk in terms of what they call the pre-pottery Neolithic, dating from about 9,600 down to about 8,000 BC, possibly slightly later. But as far as the actual state of the type of tools, it varies. Firstly, what I've seen is that there are much older stone tools, particularly at Karahan Tepe, which has been acknowledged, that go back to the Lower Paleolithic period. So they're probably a minimum of around 250,000 years of age. But they could have been what they call heirlooms. In other words, they were picked up and kept for whatever reason, either for practical purposes or to present as some kind of gift to the gods. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there was activity at that time going on at these sites. But what I can say is that some of the stone tools that have been found, particularly at Göbekli, because they've already reached the Şanlıurfa Museum, so you can actually see them, are incredibly sophisticated, and they use a process which you'll be familiar with, from Clovis points and whatever, which is pressure flaking.
Yeah.
Now, pressure flaking means that you can create stone tools that look like Swarovski jewels, beautiful artifacts. And this is a particular style that originates far in the east, as far east as Mongolia and Siberia, around 30,000 years ago. And what happens is that it slowly comes into Europe, mostly into Russia, but also into Eastern Europe, but also comes down into southwestern Asia and eventually enters Anatolia, probably about 10 to 11,000 BC.
Is this Solutrean?
I mean, if you go, you can see these stone tools. I mean, most of them are made of flint, but some of them are made out of obsidian, which is a much more brittle.
It's easier to work than flint.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's easier, but it's also easier to break it.
Yeah.
But, because it's like shards, it's the sharpest thing in the world. Almost.
Yeah, I've worked it.
I mean,
I've worked both flint and obsidian.
Yeah. So you see these incredibly sophisticated tools. As I said, you can see them. They're on display at Llanfair Museum.
Okay, cool.
But alongside, you quite rightly point out, there's much cruder ones, and I think that is part of the hunter-gathering society who have been brought in to construct these monuments.
That's kind of what I think that's really where I'm leaning, is that it's two different. There's at least two different levels of sophistication there. There's a very rudimentary, simple level of building type, which could possibly be the simple lithics, but also those unhewn cobblestone walls. Right, that looks like a restoration effort in a lot of cases.
But, you've got to be careful here. I mean, we can go somewhere like Peru, and see examples of like huge, puffy, polygonal megalithic blocks, and we can see the smaller ones on top of that, and then we can see the rough hewn walls above that, which can clearly be associated, let's say, with the Inca, and that tells us that the lower levels are from a pre-Incan civilization. That's so obvious that even a child can essentially point that out. But I think it's much more difficult when you go to places in the ancient world, because it's so easy to say, that looks sophisticated, therefore the walls around it must be much more recent. And the dating evidence that we've got does not basically suggest that at this time.
No, I think the walls are old.
As far as
the walls are as old, the walls are some of the oldest dating too.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I mean, the best that we can say is that some of the carved stones clearly are already in secondary use by the time you come to about 9,000 BC. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were carved thousands of years earlier.
Right.
I mean, to me, Tash Tepeler starts around 10,000 BC in the area of Llanfair. There are probably various different cultures involved. You've got probably people coming up from the south, probably as far south as Egypt. I mean, there are sites in Egypt, particularly a place called Helwan, which is today a big city just to the south of Cairo, where you had settlements going back to 19,000 BC, which were very sophisticated, and they exist concurrently with Göbekli Tepe and Karahan, and the stone tools found there match those found in the area of Llanfair at the same time, particularly something called the Helwan Point, which I've done a lot of work on, and so did Klaus Schmidt, the actual discoverer of Göbekli Tepe. He realised that there was a relationship between the area of Göbekli Tepe and Helwan in Egypt, probably before anybody else. I mean, I got onto it, wrote about it in great detail in my book, The Cygnus Key. But anyway, so you've got that, plus you've probably also got peoples coming down from the mountains, the Zagros Mountains. They were called the Zazian peoples. They're the ones that probably bring in the traditions to do with the vultures and the idea of excarnation and sky burials and stuff like that, because almost certainly that's what they were already doing. But then you've got other peoples probably coming in from the west, probably from the Aegean area, Western Turkey, highly sophisticated people that were using seafaring vessels to get across to Cyprus by this time. I mean, the earliest mass settlements of Cyprus go back at least to 11,000 BC. Now, this wasn't just a few people turning up occasionally. This was the establishment of a massive society. Hundreds of people must have been going back and forth from the mainland to Cyprus to sustain this society over such a long period of time. So they had seafaring vessels. So that was more people coming in that would have had this knowledge. They were probably coming into southeastern Anatolia. Plus, you've got these other elite that I'm talking about that almost certainly start their journey in Siberia and Mongolia. And even though you might say, well, 30,000 years ago is an awful long time ago, it's like waves. It's like waves of a tide gradually getting closer and closer into Anatolia. Plus, we know that contact now between Siberia, Mongolia and Anatolia was continuing on right the way through until the beginning of the Younger Dryas period. This is brand new information that I was able to obtain, and this is going to be a big, big thing that the archaeologists are working on a site, I can't say exactly where, but it's just on the edge of the Tashtepela region where they found evidence of activity that can only have come from Siberia.
Awesome.
And it suggests that people are migrating back and forwards from Siberia to Anatolia as early as 11,000 BC, 30,000 years ago. So this would have been just before the time of the Younger Dryas event. So, so so we got these people coming in, and I think they're the ones that end up being the shamanic elite, the prime movers. And they then bring everybody together with all their different skills. The carvers, the rock carvers, and the agriculturalists, the people that are good for each different part of their society, and that's how Tashtepela is created.
I find it strange that it's like, once again, I know this, obviously we have an incomplete record in archaeology, so maybe we'll find something in the future, but it seems like it's a fully formed iconography and style that just boom, and it's everywhere, all in the Tashtepela. And it's like, what? Where did this come from? That's kind of the thing that gets me about it. Where is there a sort of development phase?
Yeah.
Like, do we see development of this iconography? And
Well, I mean, clearly something new was going on. For Tashtepela, but this is the combination of various different, let's call them hunter-gathering societies coming together to create these. But clearly, you've got thousands of years of expertise coming with this as well. And I think this is coming from various different directions. As I said, definitely coming up from the Levant. It's probably coming in from Western Turkey, and it's coming down via either the Caucasus or across the Zagros Mountains from Iran to the east, or from Russia and the steppe in the north, which, remember, is like your superhighway, that takes you from Europe all the way into China. And you would probably even had links with Vedic tradition or pre-Vedic tradition, peoples who would have been trading, possibly exotic materials, certain types of minerals and stones, in particular, would have been using that Silk Road, which basically comes within just 15, 20 miles of the area of Karahan itself. So we're talking about cosmopolitan cultures here. The other important thing is that before Tashtepela, there were a series of much earlier settlements that seem to be like the proto-form of Tashtepela on the Tigris River. Now, it's much closer to the big inland sea known as Lake Van. And there were several of these, and like Bonchukli Tala, and various other names. We've gone out my head at the moment. But anyway, we visited some of them. And, these are clearly the precursors of Tashtepela. And these people have definitely got links with the Caucasus. And they're definitely, one of their big trades is in obsidian. Obsidian seems to be the peacemaker, if you like. It's like, if you're some kind of salesman back in the day, and say, yeah, look, I've got these beautiful obsidian pieces here, which we can have a big deal, but let's sit down and have a meal first and talk about things, and we'll come to some kind of agreement later on.
Yeah.
I mean, this type of hunter-gatherer exchange society is something which almost certainly was bringing in these new people into the area, and the exchange of exotic materials, exotic goods would have been part of that process.
I definitely like this idea that
All
it's,
right, we're done for
that
now.
it's more of
We're
a,
done for this stream. Thank you very much.
like something happens in terms of
Thank you, True Faith, for being here. Thank you, Toad, for being here.
transportation or
Lurkers,
something,
everybody.
all of
Merry
these cultures
Christmas.
start to interact with each other, and so then you would have the spreading of knowledge and ideas, and then if there's peace and everything, then you could literally have like the coming together, like you're suggesting, of artisans and everybody to do something that's never been done before.
Yeah.
And
yet, but
And
still
they've got a common goal as well.
Yeah. But still we go back to
Go on.
we go back to like, and you did say like we have to remember that this comes from the Hebrew legends, but the Watchers.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're going to flex for record keeping.
You're saying Anunnaki, is
like we do every
that's how you
stream.
say it? And the Denisovans.
Well, yeah, I mean.
So if they were giants coming from Siberia.
Yes.
And the Watchers were supposed to teach like metallurgy, and agriculture and irrigation and like all this stuff we were talking about. But this is so that implies.
Thank you. You made my stream, you made my day, you made my Christmas. Have a Merry Christmas,
exactly.
both of you and Lurkers and everybody.
Of firsts which the Watchers were said to have given to their mortal wives
You rule.
is really the rudiments of civilization.
Yes,
really.
exactly.
And it's the same with the Anunnaki, or the Anuna, as they really should be called. This is a memory of these prime movers coming into this region. And I mean, quite clearly, they probably look different. I mean, yes, they've probably got some height above the indigenous peoples. Let's assume that. But they probably looked different. They're coming in from somewhere which we would now associate with Northern Asia, possibly even Eastern Asia. They would have looked different, and the way that they would have been described. I mean, the Watchers
Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas, thank you.
Viper, faces like, visages like vipers is one of the terms. In other words, they look like snakes. Now,